and I want to welcome you all. Today we're thrilled to host Dr. Pia Gottschaller on the second of our Zoom conversations that we do at Luxembourg & Co., dedicated to 30 minutes bite-sized expert talks on artists and artworks. Pia is a senior lecturer at painting conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art here in London. Her research belongs to the field between technical art history, which lies on the seam between conservation and art history. In other words, Pia studies modern and contemporary painters by focusing on the materials, tools, processes, etc. that these artists employ. Today, Pia will be discussing Lucio Fontana. She is an expert on the practice of Fontana, and we do this talk on the occasion of our presentation at TEFAF New York of a wonderful painting by Fontana. Normally, the name Fontana is evoked in the context of an art history lecture through conceptual or even philosophical terms. His groundbreaking gesture of piercing his canvases in order to undermine their physical limits and reveal a metaphysical potential that lies beyond the painting itself has made him one of the most famous artists in post-war art history. This gesture marked a revolutionary moment in the history of painting by joining the physical qualities of the art object with its metaphysical aspirations. But while the gesture of cutting a piece of canvas seems like a simple conceptual act, Pia's talk today will reveal just how complicated, both technically and materially, was his work, and how the material concerns of Fontana's work relate profoundly to his metaphysical inquiry. Pia, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alma, and thank you first of all for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here and thankful for the opportunity to talk to you about Fontana today. And I also thank everyone who's joining us tonight. So let me start sharing my screen. And then, Alma, if you can give me some feedback as to whether you, oh, wait, not quite, as to whether everything's fine and dandy. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm going to make your photo smaller. All right. So we've got about 30 minutes tonight, and what I would like to talk to you about is how in Fontana's work, his concepts, in particular about space, dovetailed with the material realization of what he was doing. And okay, let me see how this is with my mouse. Anyway, and so what I thought I would do first is to give you a really, really brief introduction to his life, where he was born, what he was interested in when he was younger, and how all that led him to the moment of when he made the Concetto Spaziale that is at the center of today's presentation, and I think one of the most amazing buchi. Buco means whole in Italian, buchi is the plural, and that's the informal name for the cycle of works that we'll primarily discuss today, and which Alma is presenting as part of the TEFAF fair. So first, a bit about his life. He was born in 1899 in the second biggest city of Argentina, called Rosario di Santa Fe. And he, like 50% of the population of Rosario at the time, was originally of Italian descent. His father was Italian. And when Lucio Fontana was 7, his father took him for the first time back to Italy, to Milan, where the family on his father's side originally was from. And he started going to school there. Over the course of his life, Fontana died in 1968 in Italy. So over the course of his life, he went back and forth a number of times. He went back after his schooling in the 1920s, 1927, and then he went back again in 1940 and came back for the last time to Milan in 1947. So there's quite a bit of back and forth, and apparently he also, Fontana, spoke a really interesting mixture of Spanish, sort of Milanese, northern Italian dialect. Fontana, and that's something that I will stress throughout the presentation today, he was an extremely experimental man. He was very curious and he had an incredibly open mind. And this particular quality set him greatly aside from everyone in his own generation. But I think also when you look at the entire history of modern art and the way, one of the many ways in which this curious mind manifested itself was in the fact that he worked in an abstract and a figurative mode throughout his whole life. And he actually only very late in life, when he was almost 50, started to make the works, the buchi and the tagli, as the slash paintings often called informally, when he was quite advanced in his career. So a lot of the early influences that he experienced when he was studying back in Milan in the 1920s, all had a massive influence on the development of his concept of space. And the experimentation that led to it and that led him to explore this idea of the concept of space are all informed by these early influences. And so on the left-hand side, you see a work that is he was commissioned to make for a competition that he won for the Salone della Vittoria, which, and that this is also part of his history, of course, which was a celebration of the Italian war that they won in Ethiopia. So it's a colonial gesture. It consisted of a 6-meter tall gesso sculpture that you see in the center there. The work doesn't exist anymore. But he, for a long time in his life, actually made a living by creating these large figurative sculptures, often for a funerary context. But quite early on, he began to be absolutely fascinated by futurism. And futurism, as you know, had many facets to it. A fascist side, there was a great fascination by the fascists, including, or especially, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who had founded the movement in 1909. But it was very much geared towards a sort of utopian conception of what the future holds and where the development of humanity was headed. And the embrace of futurists of science and technology, speed as factors that help humanity sort of develop and get to the next stage is something that Fontana very much took on board. And in the various manifestos that he wrote throughout his life, and co-wrote throughout his life, this sort of constant return to the themes of how science and technology can help us come to the next stage in our development is something that you, for example, see also manifested in the work on the right-hand side, rather early work. From the early 50s, it might be the first actual neon work made in Europe. And it consisted, again, doesn't exist anymore, but what we know about it lets us to believe that it consisted of about 200-meter long neon tubing that was suspended in this beautiful arabesque at the top of the stairs. And this slide is also just a really, really brief view into the kinds of works that Fontana was making at the same time as he was making the buco that we'll take a look at in a second, just to give you a greater sense of what else he was engaged in. He worked on many different cycles in parallel, and a lot of what he was doing in one cycle, or an experience that he was making in one cycle, was then carried over into the next one. So this idea of experimentation was prevalent. He himself considered himself a sculptor, so this exploration of space, which is at the core of all of these works, is something that was originally informed from his sculptural perspective. And also the titles, as you can see also in this slide, the titles always refer to these objects referring to space, sort of show that, but he became more and more, if you will, a painter as he went along. So let's look at the work in question. It is, like all these works, called Concetto Spaziale, and it is, I think, an outgrowth of Fontana's interest in in Albert Einstein's theories of relativity, the general and special theory of relativity, in which he posited that space and time are part of the same continuum, that they're not two different things, but that they all belong to the same continuum. And Einstein then proposed the idea of space-time. And this is a term that reappears in many, many different interviews and writings of Fontana. It's not that easy to understand. And I think it's partially maybe why he did keep coming back to this topic throughout his life until he died in 68, because it is a complex subject, but it's something that I think he showed us in a very beautiful visual way. And essentially, what we're looking at is a raw canvas surface. In this particular case, it's a very large work. As you can see, it's a square, which is a beautiful sort of harmonious measurement format, sorry, and his idea of what space consists of, you know, a physical space, literally the physical space of the space in front of us that we're occupying in front of the painting, but then also the space that we move into behind the canvas, just in our minds. Then there's the visual space, what you actually see on the canvas and what helps you make that journey. And then there's the material space, where you're literally looking at a canvas surface that was, in this particular case, punctured, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But by puncturing, this physical surface actually becomes a membrane. So your mind and your eyes are therefore able to move back and forth between what's in front of it and what's behind it. And it's, in a way, an invitation to us to move beyond what immediately meets the eye. And so when we take a look at the reverse, those of you who know me know that I believe in the fact that the reverse of a canvas, of a painting, can tell us a lot about what's going on the front, and that's also the case here. So you'll see that the reverse is actually primed. It means that it was prepared with a white layer, which probably was originally meant to be on the front, but in this case it's on the reverse. And so if you look at, say, the same area as I've done here in the slide, look at the detail of the surface and then look at the same area and what's going on the back, it feels like you're looking in a way at the things in the wrong way, because what normally would be the surface is here the front, and vice versa. And I think it's this interchangeability of spaces that interested Fontana. So if you remember for now how these openings look, you know, I think you can already tell from this detail that Fontana used a tool. We'll look at which ones in a minute from the front, and on the reverse then you've got some of these canvas fibers sticking out, and because of where the lights were positioned when the photograph was taken, you can also see here, for example, some shadows being created. And so that's a sculptural quality that Fontana then went on to explore in different ways. Now, I was recently in a bookstore and I saw the cover of this book, and of course I was first drawn to it because it has a Fontana taglio on it, and I'm always happy to see that. But then I looked at the title and realized that it was clearly had been considered by the writer as a perfect example of explaining to people why even a work by Fontana actually wouldn't be easy to make for your 5-year-old. And I entirely agree with that, and I hope to show you today why. But I've also then gone on to think that I tend to pick artists who elicit those kinds of comments. So Cy Twombly is another one. A lot of the minimalist painters that I study are artists that I think sometimes are considered artists who make work that could have easily been done by someone else. However, I rejoice today in the opportunity to explain why I think there's a lot of skill involved and a lot of practice in making what he did. Now, let's look at another work from roughly the same time period that is another example of the kinds of experimentation that he was then engaging in. So again, you're looking at a surface that normally, in this case, the priming that we saw in the other work was on the reverse. Here it's on the front, but it creates this pristine surface which makes the violation, if you will, of the pristine surface even more apparent. And what Fontana was doing with these buchi, with these holes and gashes, was he was sort of destroying the sacrosanct surface of a painting, and in doing that he sort of referred really to the concept of painting being a window into the world that had first been proposed by Leon Battista Alberti in the Renaissance, where he explained how a painting that uses perspective to show the world can then function as a window into the world. And this is exactly what Fontana was doing away with, this sort of illusionism, and he created instead this object that instead allows your mind to wander into what's behind it. And in this particular work, I hope you can see that also in the detail, he both punctured from the front and the reverse. And let me show you in this detail that in he sort of exploited these beautiful effects that light creates on these surfaces that have been made into a membrane very beautifully by shining. This is we don't know much about it, but apparently these paintings of his were used in a broadcast by Rai in the early 50s. And there I think you can see clearly how much these constellations actually suggest galaxies and constellations of stars. And so a lot of these works, some make direct reference, I think, visually to the outer space, to the cosmos, and to time space. Because when you look at these surfaces and you try to reconstruct how they were made, you can't help but reconstruct in your mind the act of puncturing these surfaces. And now we know, because of the research of the Italian scientist Vittorio Gallese, that it is our mirror neurons that basically force us actually to recreate in our mind this act. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. As I said in the introduction, Fontana was quite mature by the time he discovered this opening mechanism, and so the first buco that we have that survives was this one from 1949. It's also very large at 1 by 1 meter, and it was made on paper, which, if you think about the material constellation of working at home, if you want to puncture something and if you want to do it quite clearly, I think everyone's intuition would be to first use paper. There's an anecdote that also suggests that that's kind of how Fontana did come upon this discovery. But then, because of the tears that you can also see in this work, this is the same one from the reverse, he had to attach excuse me, a piece of fabric, this is muslin, to the reverse to kind of stabilize it, and then he repunctured certain holes, not all of them, but many of them. But it was really quite a laborious process, and the paper, is, if you think about it, really quite a fragile material, and so he did switch to canvas. Over time, he also introduced, as you can see in this beautiful example on the left, he also started working with color in the early 50s. He sometimes added sand in order to recreate the sparkle of stars in a galaxy, and used something which in Italian is called lustrini. They're these tiny, excuse me, aluminium particles which are anodized to different colors, and so there's a lot of use of these beautiful little elements to further suggest the cosmic dimension of these works. And then at one point he also started to incorporate these bits of glass, which he received from glass manufacturers in Murano that we have identified, and they're very beautiful. But at this point things became quite baroque, as you can tell, and quite voluptuous in certain ways, and they kind of sometimes actually detract a little bit from the cosmic qualities. And so I think the work that we're looking at today is, you know, in a sense, the most pure embodiment of his conceptual idea of what space is and how we enter it and what it helps us do in our mind. About 10 years after Fontana started making the book, he then began to work with perhaps the sign, if you will, if you want to call it that he's most well known for, the taglio, the cuts. And again, there it was a matter of experimentation. And I think that when you look at the progression throughout this cycle, which I'll very briefly only talk about today, but you can tell that he brought the experiences from the buki into the taglio, because when he first started working with these slashes, he had trouble creating a perfect equilibrium of tension between the front and the back. If you look at the work in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that the canvas, because of a lack of tension, sags in places and it isn't perfectly plain anymore. But in order for that, I think in order for us and our minds to be able to really traverse the surface, you can't be caught on the surface by things that look like they were damages. And that was the biggest challenge that Fontana then faced, was to how to work with canvas, but make it as plain and as solid as possible in order to prevent the insinuation that something had actually been damaged rather than been done on purpose. And so what he started doing was that he fortified the reverse of his canvases, again, either with priming, and that's something that he, I think, had learned from the buki, because every buko has either on the front or the back such a layer which stiffens and stiffens the fabric, makes it be plainer. But in the slashes, it was even more important, because the disruption of the tension is even more dramatic. And here you see one of the materials that we know he used. It's called cementite, and it's alkyd based. It's basically a very cheap material you can buy in a hardware store, and people use it for plugging holes in walls, and it's, you know, it dries quite quickly, it becomes very stiff, and it was sort of the perfect material for creating the stiffness on the front, which would then be balanced by the paint layers on the reverse, balanced by the paint layers on the front. Now, this is another example that I put in just to, because Alma and I had talked about how some of these earlier bukis also have beautiful, literally starry constellations, and the actual shape, of course, depends directly on the kind of tool he used. And these are just some of the awls, in Italian they're called punte ruoli, that we found in his second studio in the countryside near Varese in northern Italy. And depending on how much force you use for puncturing the canvas, you know, how deep you let the tool enter into the canvas, the bigger the hole, the smaller the hole, and depending on the diameter, the shape of the actual tool, that will then have an effect on what the hole looks like. And in this one, you even have these sort of longitudinal openings, which he sort of gave up on at one point, because I think they don't really look like stars. They're kind of interesting, but they don't really go with the overall cosmic theme, I think. And this is a documentary photograph. It's probably staged like all the other photographs that Ugo Mullers took of Fontana working in the studio. He didn't like being watched or filmed or photographed, but it gives you an idea of the concentration involved. And that's something else that's maybe worth pointing out, that with this kind of process, which, you know, requires quite a lot of time in terms of preparation, drying time. He applied several layers on the front, monochrome in a lot of cases. That is a skill totally by itself. But you also then really only have one shot. And these particular works have a subtitle called, if it's one slash attesa, and if there are several slashes, attese, the plural. and that probably translates best into English as anticipation. And I think it kind of refers to the almost meditation-like concentration that Fontana said he needed to sort of gather before actually making a cut, because you only really get one shot, or else everything was for nothing, and it had to, you know, start at the exact right place, and it has to stop at the end, where, you know. And anyway, so I think that was partially why he didn't want anyone really watching him while he did it. And these are the kinds of standing knives that he used for these works. And as you can imagine, you have to be careful that you don't have too many slashes too close to each other, or again, you lose tension. And one of the problems that he didn't run into with the buki is that because they're normally so small, when you look at the front of the work, the space behind it just appears black, but you kind of want to make sure that you have this sort of neutral blackness suggested in order to really let your mind wander. And with the taillis, some of which are quite long, he at one point started attaching these narrow strips of black tailoring fabric to the reverse. He sort of built these little tents almost, you know, they're all a bit protruding so that they wouldn't, so that the black fabric wouldn't touch the actual cuts, all of which then, when you look at the front, suggests this sort of black nondescript space. And how am I doing for time, Yuan? A few more minutes?
We're close to the end, but please.
Okay. Right. Let me just show two more examples of the, you know, experimental path that Fontana kept exploring.
Yes.
And so these are you know, born of the same idea, but in this particular case, it's a big triptych consisting of copper sheeting, which he then, with, as a woman artist called Nanda Vigo, who acted as a sort of assistant for a while, explained in an interview, required a lot of physical force, and she helped him do this because he started the circle when he was sort of getting towards the end of his life. But there you get an idea of, you know, the bigger size of tool he required, and he actually had to use a hammer. But the copper, this is actually the right-hand side here, that's a detail of this work, even though the color is so different in the photographs, but it gives you an idea of how malleable the material is. But again, also because of how the shadows work on these very reflective surfaces, he didn't need to attach a black fabric to the reverse. This worked quite sort of by itself. But you can also see how reflective these surfaces are, and they are inspired by a trip that Fontana took to New York for a big exhibition that he had there in the 60s. Anyway, this takes me to the end. This is just as a final photograph, a little still life that Fontana's relatives sort of arranged in his studio in Comabio, where I found a lot of these materials. And on the floor, you can see a lot of paint traces that stem from him painting tile, probably on the floor in all kinds of various colors. Yeah, so that takes me to the end. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.